The Lord of the World, Part 10. Chapter 8, Part 1. Long before dawn on the first morning of the new year, the approaches to the Abbey were already blocked. Victoria Street, Great George Street, Whitehall, even Millbank Street itself were full and motionless. Broad Sanctuary, divided by the low-walled motor track, was itself cut into great blocks and wedges of people by the ways which the police kept open for the passage of important personages, and Palace Yard was kept rigidly clear except for one island, occupied by a stand which was itself full from top to bottom and end to end. All roofs and parapets which commanded a view of the Abbey were also one mass of heads. Overhead, like solemn moons, burned the white lights of the electric globes. It was not known at exactly what hour the tumult had steadied itself to definite purpose, except for a few weary controllers of the temporary turnstiles which had been erected the evening before. It had been announced a week previously that, in consideration of the enormous demand for seats, all persons who presented their worship ticket at an authorized office and followed the directions issued by the police would be accounted as having fulfilled the duties of citizenship in that respect. And it was generally made known that it was the government's intention to toll the great bell of the Abbey at the beginning of the ceremony, and at the incensing of the image, during which period silence must be as far as possible preserved by all those within hearing. London had gone completely mad on the announcement of the Catholic plot on the afternoon before. The secret had leaked out about 14 o'clock, an hour after the betrayal of the scheme to Mr. Snowford, and practically all commercial activities had ceased on the instant. By 15:30, all stores were closed, the Stock Exchange, the city offices, the West End establishments. All had, by reversible impulse, suspended business, and from within 2 hours after noon until nearly midnight, when the police had been adequately reinforced and enabled to deal with the situation, whole mobs and armies of men, screaming squadrons of women, troops of frantic youths, had paraded the streets, howling, denouncing, and murdering. It was not known how many deaths had taken place, but there was scarcely a street without the signs of outrage. Westminster Cathedral had been sacked, every altar overthrown, indescribable indignities performed there. An unknown priest had scarcely been able to consume the Blessed Sacrament before he was seized and throttled. The Archbishop with 11 priests and 2 bishops had been hanged at the north end of the church. 35 convents had been destroyed. St. George's Cathedral burned to the ground. And it was reported even, by the evening papers, that it was believed that, for the first time since the introduction of Christianity into England, there was not one tabernacle left within 20 miles of the Abbey. London, explained the new people, in huge headlines, was cleansed at last of the dingy and fantastic nonsense. It was known at about 15:30 o'clock that at least 70 volors had left for Rome, and a half-hour later that Berlin had reinforced them by 60 more. At midnight, fortunately at a time when the police had succeeded in shepherding the crowds into some kind of order, the news was flashed onto cloud and placard alike that the grim work was done, and that Rome had ceased to exist. The early morning papers added a few details, pointing out, of course, the coincidence of the fall with the close of the year, relating how, by an astonishing chance, practically all the heads of the hierarchy throughout the world had been assembled in the Vatican, which had been the first object of attack, and how these, in desperation, it was supposed, had refused to leave the city when news came by wireless telegraphy that the punitive force was on its way. There was not a building left in Rome. The entire place, Leonine City, Trastevere, suburbs, everything was gone. For the volors, poised at an immense height, had parceled out the city beneath them with extreme care, before beginning to drop the explosives. And 5 minutes after the first roar from beneath, and the first burst of smoke and flying fragments, the thing was finished. The volors had then dispersed in every direction, pursuing the motor and rail tracks along which the population had attempted to escape as soon as the news was known, and it was supposed that not less than 30,000 belated fugitives had been annihilated by this foresight. It was true, remarked the studio, that many treasures of incalculable value had been destroyed, but this was a cheap price to pay for the final and complete extermination of the Catholic pest. There comes a point, it remarked, when destruction is the only cure for a vermin-infested house, and it proceeded to observe that now that the Pope, with the entire College of the Cardinals, all the ex-royalties of Europe, and all the most fanatic religionists from the inhabited world who had taken up their abode in the Holy City, were gone at a stroke, a recrudescence of the superstition was scarcely to be feared elsewhere. Yet care must even now be taken against any relenting. Catholics, if any were left bold enough to attempt it, must no longer be allowed to take any part in the life of any civilized country. So far as messages had come in from other countries, there was but one chorus of approval at what had been done. A few papers regretted the incident, or rather the spirit which had lain behind it. It was not seemly, they said, that humanitarians should have recourse to violence. Yet not one pretended that anything could be felt but thanksgiving for the general result. Ireland, too, must be brought into line. They must not dally any longer. It was now brightening slowly towards dawn. Beyond the river, through the faint wintry haze, a crimson streak or two began to burn. But all was surprisingly quiet, for this crowd, tired out with an all-night watch, chilled by the bitter cold, and intent on what lay before them, had no energy left for useless effort. Only from packed square and street and lane went up a deep, steady murmur, like the sound of the sea a mile away, broken now and again by the hoot and clang of a motor and the rush of its passage as it tore eastwards, round the circle through the broad sanctuary, and vanished citywards. And the light broadened, and the electric globes sickened and paled, and the haze began to clear a little, showing not the fresh blue that had been hoped for from the cold of the night, but a high, colorless vault of cloud, washed with gray and faint rose color, as the sun came up, a ruddy copper disk beyond the river. At 9 o'clock the excitement rose to a high degree. The police between Whitehall and the Abbey, looking from their high platforms strung along the route, whence they kept watch and controlled the wire palisadings, showed a certain activity, and a minute later a police car whirled through the square between the palings and vanished round the Abbey towers. The crowd murmured and shuffled and began to expect that a cheer was raised, when a moment later 4 more cars appeared, bearing the government insignia, and disappeared in the same direction. These were the officials, they said, going to Dean's Yard, where the procession would assemble. At about 9:45, the crowd at the west end of Victoria Street began to raise its voice in a song, and by the time that it was over, and the bells had burst out from the Abbey towers, a rumor had somehow made its entrance that Felsenburgh was to be present at the ceremony. There was no assignable reason for this, neither then nor afterwards. In fact, the Evening Star declared that it was one more instance of the astonishing instinct of human beings en masse, for it was not until an hour later that even the government were made aware of the facts. Yet the truth remained that at 10:30 one continuous roar went up, drowning even the brazen clamor of the bells, reaching round to Whitehall and the crowded pavements of Westminster Bridge, demanding Julian Felsenburgh. Yet there had been absolutely no news of the President of Europe for the last fortnight, beyond an entirely unsupported report that he was somewhere in the East. And all the while the motors poured from all directions toward the Abbey and disappeared under the arch into Dean's Yard, bearing those fortunate persons whose tickets actually admitted them to the church itself. Cheers ran and rippled along the lines as the great men were recognized. Lord Pemberton, Oliver Brandon his wife, Mr. Caldecott, Maxwell Snowford, with a delegation of delegates. Even the melancholy-faced Mr. Francis himself, the government ceremoniarius, received a greeting. But by 11:15, when the pealing bells paused, the stream had stopped, the barriers issued out to stop the roads, the wire palisadings vanished, and the crowd, for an instant, ceased its roaring, sighed with relief at the relaxed pressure, and surged out into the roadways. Then once more the roaring began for Julian Felsenburgh. The sun was high now, still a copper disk, above the Victoria Tower, but paler than an hour ago. The whiteness of the Abbey, the heavy greys of Parliament House, the 10,000 tints of rooftops, heads, streamers, placards, began to disclose themselves. A single bell tolled 5 minutes to the hour, and the moments slipped by, until once more the bell stopped, and to the ears of those within hearing of the great west doors came the first blare of a huge organ, reinforced by trumpets. And then, as sudden and profound as the hush of death, there fell an enormous silence. Part 2. As the 5 minutes bells began, sounding like a continuous wind note on the great vaults overhead, solemn and persistent, Mabel drew a long breath and leaned back in her seat from the rigid position in which, for the last half hour, she had been staring out at the wonderful sight. She seemed to herself to have assimilated it at last, to be herself once more, to have drunk her fill of the triumph and the beauty. She was as one who looked upon a summer sea on the morning after a storm, and now the climax was at hand. From end to end and side to side, the interior of the abbey presented a great broken mosaic of human faces, living slopes, walls, sections and curves. The south transept, directly opposite to her, from pavement to rose window, was one sheet of heads. The floor was paved with them, cut in two by the scarlet of the gangway leading from the chapel of St. Faith, on the right. The choir beyond the open space before the sanctuary was a mass of white figures, scarfed and surpliced. The high organ gallery, beneath which the screen had been removed, was crowded with them. And, far down beneath, the dim nave stretched the same endless pale living pavement to the shadow beneath the west window. Between every group of columns behind the choir stalls. Before her, to the right, left, and behind, were platforms contrived in the masonry, and the exquisite roof, fan tracery, and soaring capital alone gave the eye an escape from humanity. The whole vast space was full, it seemed, of delicate sunlight that streamed in from the artificial light set outside each window, and poured the ruby and the purple and the blue from the old glass in long shafts of color across the dusty air, and in broken patches on the faces and dresses beneath. The murmur of 10,000 voices filled the place, supplying, it seemed, a solemn accompaniment to that melodious note that now pulsed above it. And finally, more significant than all, was the empty carpeted sanctuary at her feet, the enormous altar with its flight of steps, the gorgeous curtain and the great untenanted sedilia. Mabel needed some such reassurance, for last night, until the coming of Oliver, had passed for her as a kind of appalling waking dream. From the first shock of what she had seen outside the church, through those hours of waiting, with the knowledge that this was the way in which the spirit of peace asserted its superiority, up to that last moment when, in her husband's arms, she had learned of the fall of Rome, it had appeared to her as if her new world had suddenly corrupted about her. It was incredible, she told herself, that this ravening monster, dripping blood from claws and teeth, that had arisen roaring in the night, could be the humanity that had become her God. She had thought revenge and cruelty and slaughter to be the brood of Christian superstition, dead and buried under the newborn angel of light, and now it seemed that the monsters yet stirred and lived. All the evening she had sat, walked, lain about her quiet house with a horror heavy about her, flinging open a window now and again in the icy air to listen with clenched fists to the cries and the roarings of the mob that raged in the streets beneath, the clanks, the yells, and the hoots of the motor trains that tore up from the country to swell the frenzy of the city, to watch the red glow of fire, the volumes of smoke that heaved up from the burning chapels and convents. She had questioned, doubted, resisted her doubts, flung out frantic acts of faith, attempted to renew the confidence that she attained in her meditation, told herself that traditions died slowly. She had knelt, crying out to the spirit of peace that lay, as she knew so well, at the heart of man. Though overwhelmed for the moment by evil passion, a line or two ran in her head from one of the old Victorian poets. You doubt if anyone could think or bid it? How could it come about? Who did it? Not men, not here. Oh, not beneath the sun, the torch that smoldered till the cup overran the wrath of God, which was the wrath of man. She even contemplated death, as she told her husband, the taking of her own life, in a great despair with the world. Seriously, she had thought of it. It was an escape perfectly in accord with her morality. The useless and agonizing were put out of the world by common consent. The euthanasia houses witnessed to it. Then why not she? For she could not bear it. Then Oliver had come, and she had fought her way back to sanity and confidence, and the phantom had gone again. How sensible and quiet he had been, she was beginning to tell herself now, as the quiet influence of this huge throng in this glorious place of worship possessed her once more. How reasonable in his explanation that man was even now only convalescent, and therefore liable to relapse. She had told herself that again and again during the night, but it had been different when he had said so. His personality had once more prevailed, and the name of Felsenburgh had finished the work. If he were but here, she sighed, but she knew he was far away. It was not until 11:15 that she understood that the crowds outside were clamoring for him too, and that knowledge reassured her further. They knew, then, these wild tigers, where their redemption lay. They understood what was their ideal, even if they had not attained it. Ah, what if he were but here? There would be no more question. The sullen waves would sink beneath his call of peace, the hazy clouds lift, the rumble die to silence. But he was away on some strange business. Well, he knew his work. He would surely come again, soon, to his children who needed him so terribly. She had the good fortune to be alone in a crowd. Her neighbor, a grizzled old man with his daughters beyond, was her only neighbor and a stranger. At her left rose up the red-covered barricade, over which she could see the sanctuary and the curtain, and her seat in the tribune, raised some 8 feet above the floor, removed her from the possibility of conversation. She was thankful for that. She did not want to talk. She only wanted to control her faculties in silence, to reassert her faith, to look out over this enormous throng gathered to pay homage to the Great Spirit whom they had betrayed, to renew her own courage and faithfulness. She wondered what the preacher would say, whether there would be any note of penitence. Maternity was his subject, that benign aspect of universal life. Tenderness, love, quiet, receptive, protective passion, the spirit that soothes rather than inspires, that busies itself with peaceful tasks, that kindles the lights and fires of home, that gives sleep, food, and welcome. The bell stopped, and in the instant before the music she heard, clear above the murmur within, the roar of the crowds outside, who still demanded their God. Then, with a crash, the huge organ awoke, pierced by the cry of the trumpets and maddening throb of drums. There was no delicate prelude here, no slow stirring of life rising through labyrinths of mystery to the climax of sight. Here rather was full-orbed day, the high noon of knowledge and power, the day-spring from on high, dawning in mid-heaven. Her heart quickened to meet it, and her reviving confidence, still convalescent, stirred and smiled as the tremendous chords blared overhead, telling of triumph fully armed. God was man, then, after all. A God who last night had faltered for an hour, but who rose again on his morning of a new year, scattering mists, dominant over his own passion, all compelling and all beloved. God was man, and Felsenburgh his incarnation. Yes, she must believe that. She did believe that. Then she saw how already the long procession was winding up beneath the screen, and in imperceptible art the light grew yet more acutely beautiful. They were coming, then, those ministers of a pure worship, grave men who knew in what they believed, and who, even if they did not at this moment thrill with feeling, for she knew that in this respect her husband for one did not, yet believed the principles of this worship and recognized their need of expression for the majority of mankind, coming slowly up in fours and pairs and units, led by robed vergers, rippling over the steps and emerging again into the colored sunlight in all their bravery of Masonic apron, badge, and jewel. Surely here was reassurance enough. The sanctuary now held a figure or two. Anxious-faced Mr. Francis, in his robes of office, came gravely down the steps and stood awaiting the procession, directing with almost imperceptible motions his satellites who hovered about the aisles, ready to point this way and that to the advancing stream. And the westernmost seats were already beginning to fill, when on a sudden she recognized that something had happened. Just now the roaring of the mob outside had provided a kind of underbass to the music within, imperceptible except to subconsciousness, but clearly discernible in its absence, and this absence was now a fact. At first she thought that the signal of beginning worship had hushed them. Then, with an indescribable thrill, she remembered that in all her knowledge only one thing had ever availed to quiet a turbulent crowd. Yet she was not sure. It might be an illusion. Even now the mob might be roaring still, and she only deaf to it. But again, with an ecstasy that was very near to agony, she perceived that the murmur of voices, even within the building, had ceased, and that some great wave of emotion was stirring the sheets and slopes of faces before her as a wind stirs wheat. A moment later she was on her feet, gripping the rail, with her heart like an overdriven engine beating pulses of blood, furious and insistent, through every vein. For with great rushing surge that sounded like a sigh, heard even above the triumphant tumult overhead, the whole enormous assemblage had risen to its feet. Confusion seemed to break out in the orderly procession. She saw Mr. Francis run forward quickly, gesticulating like a conductor, and at his signal the long line swayed forward, split, recoiled, and again slid swiftly forward, breaking as it did into 20 streams that poured along the seats and filled them in a moment. Men ran and pushed, aprons flapped, hands beckoned, all without coherent words. There was a knocking of feet, the crash of an overturned chair, and then, as if a god had lifted his hand for quiet, The music ceased abruptly, sending a wild echo that swooned and died in a moment. A great sigh filled its place, and, in the colored sunshine that lay along the immense length of the gangway that ran open now from west to east, far down the distant nave, a single figure was seen advancing. Part 3. What Mabel saw and heard and felt from 11 o'clock to half an hour after noon on the first morning of the new year, she could never adequately remember. For the time she lost the continuous consciousness of self, the power of reflection, for she was still weak from her struggle. There was no longer in her the process by which the events are stored, labeled, and recorded. She was no more than a being who observed, as it were, in one long act, across which considerations played at uncertain intervals. Eyes and ears seemed her sole functions, communicating direct with a burning heart. She did not even know at what point her senses told her that this was Felsenburgh. She seemed to have known it even before he entered, and she watched him as in complete silence. He came deliberately up the red carpet, superbly alone, rising a step or two at the entrance of the choir, passing on and up before her. He was in his English judicial dress of scarlet and black, but she scarcely noticed it. For her, too, no one else existed, but he. This vast assemblage was gone, poised and transfigured in one vibrating atmosphere of an immense human emotion. There was no one, anywhere, but Julian Felsenburgh. Peace and light burned like a glory about him. For an instant after passing, he disappeared beyond the speaker's tribune, and the instant after appeared once more, coming up the steps. He reached his place. She could see his profile beneath her, slightly to the left, pure and keen as the blade of a knife, beneath his white hair. He lifted one white furred sleeve, made a single motion, and with a surge and a rumble, the 10,000 were seated. He motioned again, and with a roar they were on their feet. Again there was silence. He stood now, perfectly still, his hands laid together on the rail, his face looking steadily before him. It seemed as if he who had drawn all eyes and stilled all sounds were waiting until his domination were complete. There was but one will, one desire, and that beneath his hand. Then he began to speak. In this again, as Mabel perceived afterwards, there was no precise or verbal record within her of what he said. There was no conscious process by which she received, tested, or approved what she heard. The nearest image under which she could afterwards describe her emotions to herself was that when he thought it was she who was speaking. Her own thoughts, her dispositions, her griefs, her disappointment, her passions, her hopes, all these interior acts of the soul, known scarcely even to herself, down even, it seemed, to the minutest whirls and eddies of thought, were, by this man, lifted up, cleansed, kindled, satisfied, and proclaimed. For the first time in her life, she became perfectly aware of what human nature meant. For it was her own heart that passed out again upon the air, borne on that immense voice. Again, As once before for a few moments in Paul's house, it seemed that creation, groaning so long, had spoken articulate words at last, had come to growth and coherent thought and perfect speech. Yet then he had spoken to men. Now it was man himself speaking. It was not one man who spoke there. It was man. Man conscious of his origin, his destiny, and his pilgrimage between. Man sane again after a night of madness, knowing his strength, declaring his law, lamenting in a voice as eloquent as stringed instruments his own failure to correspond. It was a soliloquy rather than an oration. Rome had fallen. English and Italian streets had run with blood. Smoke and flame had gone up to heaven, because man had for an instant sunk back to the tiger. Yet it was done, cried the great voice, and there was no repentance. It was done, and ages hence men must still do penance and flush scarlet with shame, to remember that he once turned his back on the risen light. There was no appeal to the lurid, no picture of the tumbling palaces, the running figures, the coughing explosions. There was no appeal to the lurid, no picture of the tumbling palaces, the running figures, the coughing explosions, the shaking of the earth, and the dying of the doomed. It was rather with those hot hearts shouting in the English and German streets, or aloft in the winter air of Italy, the ugly passions that warred there, as the volors rocked at their stations, generating and fulfilling revenge, paying back plot with plot, and violence with violence. And there cried the voice, was man as he had been, fallen in an instant to the cruel old ages, before he had learned what he was and why. There was no repentance, said the voice again, but there was something better. And as the hard, stinging tones melted, the girl's eyes, dry eyes of shame, filled in an instant with tears. There was something better. The knowledge of what crimes man was yet capable of, and the will to use that knowledge. Rome was gone, and it was a lamentable shame. Rome was gone, and the air was the sweeter for it. And then in an instant, like the soar of a bird, he was up and away from the horrid gulf where he had just looked just now, from the fragments of charred bodies and tumbled houses, and all the signs of man's disgrace, to the pure air and sunlight to which man must once more set his face. Yet he bore with him in that wonderful flight the dew of tears and the aroma of earth. He had not spared words with which to lash and whip the naked human heart, and he did not spare words to lift up the bleeding, shrinking thing and comfort it with the divine vision of love. Historically speaking, it was about 40 minutes before he turned to the shrouded image behind the altar. "O maternity," he cried, "mother of us all." And then, to those who heard him, the supreme miracle took place. For it seemed now, in an instant, that it was no longer a man who spoke, but one who stood upon the stage of the superhuman. The curtain ripped back, as one who stood by it tore, panting at the strings. And there, it seemed, face to face stood the mother above the altar, huge, white, and protective, and the child, one passionate incarnation of love, crying to her from the tribune, "O mother of us all, and mother of me!" So he praised her to her face, and that sublime principle of life, declaring her glories and her strength, her immaculate motherhood, her 7 swords of anguish driven through her heart by the passion and follies of her son. He promised her great things, the recognition of her countless children, the love and service of the unborn, the welcome of those yet quickening within the tomb. He named her the wisdom of the Most High, that sweetly order of all things, the gate of heaven, the house of ivory, comforter of the afflicted, queen of the world, and, to the delirious eyes of those who looked on her, it seemed that the grave face smiled to hear him. A great panting, as some monstrous life began to fill the air, as the mob swayed behind him, and the torrential voice poured on. Waves of emotion swept up and down. There were cries and sobs, the yelping of a man beside himself at last. From somewhere among the crowded seats, the crash of a bench, and another, and another, and the gangways were full, for he no longer held them passive to listen. He was rousing them to some supreme act. The tide crawled nearer, and the faces stared no longer at the son but the mother. The girl in the gallery tore at the heavy railing and sank down sobbing upon her knees. And above all the voice pealed on, and the thin hands blanched to whiteness strained from the wide and sumptuous sleeves, as if to reach across the sanctuary itself. It was a new tale he was telling now, and all to her glory. He was from the East, now they knew, come from some triumph. He had been hailed as king, adored as divine, as was meet and right. He, the humble superhuman son of a human mother, who bore not a sword but peace, not a cross but a crown. So he seemed he was seeing, yet no man there knew whether he said it or not, whether the voice proclaimed it, or their hearts asserted it. He was on the steps of the sanctuary now, still with outstretched hands and pouring words, and the mob rolled after him to the tumble of 10,000 feet, and the sighing of 10,000 hearts. He was at the altar. He was upon it. Again, in one last cry as the crowd broke against the steps beneath, he hailed her Queen and Mother. The end came in a moment, swift and inevitable, and for an instant, before the girl in the gallery sank down, blind with tears, she saw the tiny figure poised there at the knees of the huge image, beneath the expectant hands, silent and transfigured in the blaze of light. The mother, it seemed, had found her son at last. For an instant she saw it, the soaring columns, the gilding and the colors, the swaying heads, the tossing hands. It was a sea that heaved before her. Lights went up and down. The rose windows whirled overhead. The presences filled the air. Heaven flashed away, and the earth shook it in ecstasy. Then in the heavenly light, to the crash of drums, above the screaming of the women and the battering of feet, in one thunder peal of worship, 10,000 voices hailed him Lord and God. Part 3. The Victory. Chapter 1. Part 1. The little room where the new pope sat reading was a model of simplicities. Its walls were whitewash, its roof unpolished rafters, and its floor beaten mud. A square table stood in the center, with a chair beside it. A cold brazier, laid for lighting, stood in the wide hearth. A bookshelf against the wall held a dozen volumes. There were 3 doors, one leading to the private oratory, one to the anteroom, and the third to the little paved court. The south windows were shuttered, but through the ill-fitting hinges streamed knife blades of fiery light from the hot eastern day outside. It was the time of the midday siesta, and except for the brisk scything of the cicadae from the hill slope behind the house, all was in deep silence. The Pope, who had dined an hour before, had hardly shifted his attitude in all that time, so intent was he upon his reading. For the while all was put away. His own memory of those last 3 months, the bitter anxiety, the intolerable load of responsibility. The book he held was a cheap reprint of the famous biography of Julian Felsenburgh, issued a month before, and he was now drawing to an end. It was a terse, well-written book, composed by an unknown hand, and some even suspected it to be the disguised work of Felsenburgh himself. More, however, considered that it was written at least with Felsenburgh's consent by one of that small body of intimates whom he had admitted to his society, that body which under him now conducted the affairs of East and West. From certain indications in the book, it had been argued that its actual writer was a Westerner. The main body of the work dealt with his life, or rather with those 2 or 3 years known to the world, from his rapid rise in American politics and his mediation in the East down to the event of 5 months ago, when in swift succession he had been hailed Messiah in Damascus, had been formally adored in London, and finally elected by an extraordinary majority to the tribunicate of the 2 Americas. The Pope had read rapidly through these objective facts, for he knew them well enough already, and was now studying with close attention the summary of his character, or rather, as the author rather sententiously explained, the summary of his self-manifestation to the world. He read the description of his 2 main characteristics, his grasp upon words and facts. Words, the daughters of the earth, were wedded in this man to facts, the sons of heaven, and superhuman was their offspring. His minor characteristics, too, were noticed. His appetite for literature, his astonishing memory, his linguistic powers. He possessed, it appeared, both the telescopic and the microscopic eye. He discerned worldwide tendencies and movements on one hand. He had a passionate capacity for detail on the other. Various anecdotes illustrated these remarks, and a number of terse aphorisms of his were recorded. No man forgives, he says, he only understands. It needs supreme faith to renounce a transcendent God. A man who believes in himself is almost capable of believing in his neighbor. Here was a sentence that to the Pope's mind was significant of that sublime egotism that is alone capable of confronting the Christian spirit. And again, to forgive a wrong is to condone a crime. And the strong man is accessible to no one, but all are accessible to him. There was a certain pompousness in his array of remarks, but it lay, as the Pope saw very well, not in the speaker, but in the scribe. To him who had seen the speaker it was plain how they had been uttered, with no pontifical solemnity, but whirled out in a fiery stream of eloquence, or spoken with that strangely moving simplicity that had constituted his first assault on London. It was possible to hate Felsenburgh and to fear him, but never to be amused at him. But plainly the supreme pleasure of the writer was to trace an analogy between his hero and nature. In both there was the same apparent contradictoriness, the combination of utter tenderness and utter ruthlessness. The power that heals wounds also inflicts them, that clothes the dung heap with sweet growths and grasses, breaks too into fire and earthquake, that causes the partridge to die for her young, also makes the shrike in his living larder. So too with Felsenburgh. He who had wept over the fall of Rome, a month later had spoken of extermination as an instrument that even now might be judicially used in the service of humanity, only it must be used with deliberation, not with passion. The utterance had aroused extraordinary interest, since it seemed so paradoxical that one who preached peace and toleration and argument had broken out all over the world. But beyond enforcing the dispersal of the Irish Catholics and the execution of a few individuals, so far that utterance had not been acted upon, yet the world seemed as a whole to have accepted it, and even now to be waiting for its fulfillment. As the biographer pointed out, the world enclosed in physical nature should welcome one who followed its precepts, one who was indeed the first to introduce deliberately and confessedly into human affairs such laws as those of the survival of the fittest and the immorality of forgiveness. If there was mystery in the one, there was mystery in the other, and both must be accepted if man was to develop. And the secret of this, it seemed, lay in his personality. To see him was to believe in him, or rather to accept him as inevitably true. We do not explain nature or escape from it by sentimental regrets. The bare cries of a child, the wounded stag weeps great tears, the robin kills his parents. Life exists only on condition of death, and these things happen, however we may weave theories that explain nothing. Life must be accepted on those terms. We cannot be wrong if we follow nature. Rather to accept them is to find peace. Our great mother only reveals her secrets to those who take her as she is. So, too, with Felsenburgh. It is not for us to discriminate. His personality is one of a kind that does not admit it. He is complete and sufficing for those who trust him and are willing to suffer. An hostile and hateful enigma to those who are not. We must prepare ourselves for the logical outcome of this doctrine. Sentimentality must not be permitted to dominate reason. Finally, then, the writer showed how, to this man, belonged properly to all those titles hitherto lavished upon the imagined supreme beings. It was in preparation for him that these types came into the realms of thought and influenced men's lives. He was the Creator, for it was reserved for him to bring into being the perfect life of union, to which all the world had hitherto groaned in vain. It was in his image and likeness that he had made man. Yet he was the Redeemer, too, for that likeness had in one sense always underlain the tumult of mistake and conflict. He had brought man out of darkness and the shadow of death, guiding their feet into the way of peace. He was the Savior for the same reason, the Son of Man, for he alone was perfectly human. He was the Absolute, for he was the content of ideals, the Eternal, for he had always lain in nature's potentiality, and secured by his being the continuity of that order. The Infinite, for all infinite things fell short of him who was more than their sum. He was the Alpha, then, and Omega, the beginning and the end, the first and the last. He was Dominus et Deus Noster, as Domitian had been, the Pope reflected. He was as simple and as complex as life itself. Simple in its essence, complex in its activities. And last of all, his supreme proof of his mission lay in the immortal nature of his message. There was no more to be added to what he had brought to light, for in him all diverging lines had at last found their origin and their end. As to whether or no he would prove to be personally immortal was a wholly irrelevant thought. It would be indeed fitting if through his means the vital principle should disclose its last secret, but no more than fitting. Already his spirit was in the world. The individual was no more separate from his fellows. Death no more than a wrinkle that came and went across the inviolable sea. For man had learned at last that the race was all, and self was nothing. The cell had discovered the unity of the body. Even the greatest thinkers declared the consciousness of the individual had yielded the title of personality to the corporate mass of man, and the restlessness of the unit had sunk into the peace of a common humanity, for nothing but this could explain the sensation of party strife and natural competition. And this, above all, had been the work of Felsenburgh. "Behold, I am with you always," quoted the writer in a passionate peroration, "even now in the consummation of the world, and the Comforter is come unto you. I am the door, the way, the truth, and the life, the bread of life, the water of life. My name is Wonderful, the Prince of Peace, Father Everlasting. It is I who am the desire of all nations, the fairest among the children of men. In my kingdom there shall be no end. The Pope laid down the book and leaned back, closing his eyes. Part 2. And as for himself, what did he to say of all this? A transcendent God who hid himself, a divine Savior who delayed to come, a comforter heard no longer in wind nor seen in fire. There, in the next room, was a little wooden altar, and above it an iron box, and within that box a silver cup, and within that cup something. Outside the house, 100 yards away, lay the domes and plaster roofs of a little village called Nazareth. Carmel was on the right, a mile or two away, Tabor on the left, the plain of Esdraelon in front, and behind, Cana in Galilee, and the quiet lake, and Hermon. And far away to the south lay Jerusalem. It was to this tiny strip of Holy Land that the Pope had come, the land where a faith had sprouted 2,000 years ago, and where, unless God spoke in fire from heaven, it would presently be cut down as a cumberer to the ground. It was here, on this material earth, that one had walked, whom all men had thought to have been he who would redeem Israel. In this village that he had fetched water and made boxes and chairs, on that long lake that his feet had walked, on that high hill where he had flamed in glory, on that smooth, low mountain to the north that he had declared that the meek were blessed and should inherit the earth, that peacemakers were the children of God, that they who hungered and thirst would be satisfied. And now it was come to this. Christianity had smoldered away from Europe like a sunset on darkening peaks. Eternal Rome was a heap of ruins. In east and west alike a man had been set up upon a throne of God, and had been acclaimed as divine. The world had leapt forward. Social science was supreme. Men had learned consistency. They had learned, too, the social lessons of Christianity apart from a divine teacher. Or rather, they said, in spite of him. There were left, perhaps, 3 millions, perhaps 5, at the utmost 10 millions. It was impossible to know, throughout the entire inhabited globe, who still worshiped Jesus Christ as God. And the vicar of Christ sat in a whitewashed room in Nazareth, dressed as simply as his master, waiting for the end. He had done what he could. There had been a week 5 months ago when it had been doubtful whether anything at all could be done. There were left 3 cardinals alive, himself, Steinman, and the Patriarch of Jerusalem. The rest lay mangled somewhere in the ruins of Rome. There was no precedent to follow. So the 2 Europeans had made their way out to the east, and to one town in it where quiet still reigned. With the disappearance of Greek Christianity, there had also vanished the last remnants of the internecine war in Christianity, and by a kind of tacit consent of the world, Christians were allowed a moderate liberty in Palestine. Russia, which now held the country as a dependency, had sufficient sentiment left to leave it alone. It was true that the holy places had been desecrated, and remains now only as spots of antiquarian interest. The altars were gone, but the sites were yet marked, and, although Mass could no longer be said there, it was understood that private oratories were not forbidden. It was in this state that the two European cardinals had found the Holy City. It was not thought wise to wear insignia of any description in public, and it was practically certain even now that the civilized world was unaware of their existence, for within 3 days of their arrival the old patriarch had died, yet not before Percy Franklin, surely under the strangest circumstances since those of the first century, had been elected to the supreme pontificate. It had all been done in a few minutes by the dying man's bedside. The two old men had insisted. The German had even recurred once more to the strange resemblance between Percy and Julian Felsenburgh, and had murmured his old, half-heard remarks about the antithesis and the finger of God. And Percy, marveling at his superstition, had accepted, and the election was recorded. He had taken the name of Sylvester, the last saint in the year, and was the third of that title. He had then retired to Nazareth with his chaplain. Steinmann had gone back to Germany, and been hanged in a riot within a fortnight of his arrival. The next matter was the creation of new cardinals, and to 20 persons, with infinite precautions, briefs had been conveyed. Of these, 9 had declined. 3 more had been approached, of whom only 1 had accepted. There were therefore at this moment 12 persons in the world who constituted the Sacred College. 2 Englishmen, one of whom Corcoran was one, 2 Americans, a Frenchman, a German, an Italian, a Spaniard, a Pole, a Chinaman, a Greek, and a Russian. To these were entrusted vast districts over which their control was supreme, subject only to the Holy Father himself. As regarded the Pope's own life, very little need be said. It resembled, he thought, in its outward circumstances, that of such a man as Leo the Great, without his worldly importance or pomp. Theoretically, the Christian world was under his dominion. Practically, the Christian affairs were administered by local authorities. It was impossible for 100 reasons for him to do what he wished with regard to the exchange of communications. An elaborate cipher had been designed, and a private telegraphic station organized on his roof communicating with another in Damascus, where Cardinal Cochrane had fixed his residence. And from that center messages occasionally were dispatched to ecclesiastical authorities elsewhere. But, for the most part, there was little to be done. The Pope, however, had the satisfaction of knowing that, with incredible difficulty, a little progress had been made towards the reorganization of the hierarchy in all countries. Bishops were being consecrated freely. There were not less than 2,000 of them all told, and of priests an unknown number. The Order of Christ Crucified was doing excellent work, and the tales of not less than 400 martyrdoms had reached Nazareth during the last 2 months, accomplished mostly at the hands of the mobs. In other respects, also, as well as the primary object of the order's existence, namely, the affording of an opportunity to all who loved God to dedicate themselves to Him more perfectly, the new religious were doing good work. The more perilous tasks, the work of communication between prelates, missions to persons of suspected integrity, and all business, in fact, which was carried out now and then as the vital risk of the agent, were entrusted solely to members of the order. Stringent instructions had been issued from Nazareth that no bishop was to expose himself unnecessarily. Each was to regard himself as the heart of his diocese, and to be protected at all costs, save that of Christian honor, and in consequence each had surrounded himself with a group of the new religious, men and women, who with extraordinary and generous obedience undertook such dangerous tasks as they were capable of performing. It was plain enough by now that it had not been for the order, the Church would have been little better than paralyzed under these new conditions. Extraordinary facilities were being issued in all directions. Every priest who belonged to the order received universal jurisdiction, subject to the bishop, if any, of the diocese in which he might be. Mass might be said on any day of the year of the 5 Wounds, or the Resurrection, or Our Lady, and all had the privilege of the portable altar, now permitted to be wood. Further ritual requirements were relaxed. A Mass might be said with any decent vessels, of any material capable of destruction, such as glass or china. Bread of any description might be used, and no vestments were obligatory except the thin thread that now represented the stole. Lights were non-essential. None need wear the clerical habit, and rosary, even without beads, was always permissible instead of the office. In this manner, priests were rendered capable of giving the sacraments and offering the holy sacrifice, at the least possible risk to themselves, and these relaxations had already proved enormous benefit in the European prisons, where by this time many thousands of Catholics were undergoing the penalty of refusing public worship. The Pope's private life was as simple as his room. He had 1 Syrian priest for his chaplain and 2 Syrian servants. He said his Mass each morning, himself wearing vestments and his white habit beneath, and heard a Mass after. Then he took his coffee, and after changing into the tunic and burnous of the country, and spent the morning over business. He dined at noon, slept, and rode out, for the country, by reason of its indeterminate position, was still in the simplicity of 100 years ago. He returned at dusk, supped, and worked again till late into the night. That was all. His chaplain sent what messages were necessary to Damascus, His servants, themselves ignorant of his dignity, dealt with the secular world so far as was required, and the utmost that seemed to be known to his few neighbors was that there lived in the late sheik's house, on the hill, an eccentric European with a telegraph office. His servants, themselves devout Catholics, knew him for a bishop, but no more than that. They were told only that there was yet a pope alive, and with that and the sacraments were content. To sum up, therefore, the Catholic world knew that their pope lived under the name of Sylvester, and 13 persons of the entire race knew that Franklin had been his name, and that the throne of Peter rested for the time in Nazareth. It was, as a Frenchman had said, just 100 years ago. Catholicism survived, but no more. Part 3. And as for his inner life, what can be said of that? He lay now back in his wooden chair, thinking with closed eyes. He could not have described it consistently even to himself, for indeed he scarcely knew it. He acted rather than indulged in reflex thought. But the center of his position was simple faith. The Catholic religion, he knew well enough, gave the only adequate explanation of the universe. It did not unlock all mysteries, but it was locked more than any other key known to man. He knew, too, perfectly well that it was the only system of thought that satisfied man as a whole, and accounted for him in his essential nature. Further, he saw well enough that the failure of Christianity to unite all men one to another rested not upon its feebleness, but its strength. Its lines met in eternity, not in time. Therefore, he happened to believe it. It was this foreground where there were other moods whose shifting was out of his control. In his exalt moods, which came upon him like a breeze from paradise, the background was bright with hope and drama. He saw himself and his companions as Peter and the apostles must have regarded themselves, as they proclaimed through the world, in temples, slums, marketplaces, and private houses, the faith that was to shake and transform the world. They had handled the Lord of Life, seen the empty sepulchre, grasped the pierced hands of him who was their brother and their God. It was radiantly true, though not a man believed it. It was a huge superincumbent weight of incredulity could not disturb a fact that was as the sun in heaven. Moreover, the very desperateness of their cause was their inspiration. There was no temptation to lean upon the arm of flesh, for there was none that fought for them but God. Their nakedness was their armor, their slow tongues their persuasiveness. Their weakness demanded God's strength, and found it. Yet there was this difference, and it was a significant one. For Peter, the spiritual world had an interpretation and a guarantee in the outward events he had witnessed. He had handled the risen Christ. The external corroborated the eternal. But for Sylvester, This was not so. For him it was necessary to grasp spiritual truths in the supernatural sphere that the external events of the incarnation were proved by, rather than proved the certitude of his spiritual apprehension. Certainly, historically speaking, Christianity was true, proved by its records, yet to see that needed illumination. He apprehended the power of the resurrection, therefore Christ was risen. Therefore, in heavier moods it was different with him. There were periods, lasting sometimes for days together, clouding him when he awoke, stifling him as he tried to sleep, dulling the very savor of the sacrament and the thrill of the precious blood. Times in which the darkness was so intolerable that even the solid objects of faith attenuated themselves to shadow, when half his nature was blind not only to Christ, but to God himself, and the reason of his own existence, when his own awful dignity seemed as the insignia of a fool. And was it conceivable, his earthly mind demanded, that he and his college of 12 and his few thousands should be right, and the entire consensus of the civilized world wrong? It was not that the world had not heard the message of the gospel. It had heard little else for 2,000 years, and now pronounced it false. False in its external credentials, and false therefore in its spiritual claims. It was a lost cause for which he suffered. He was not the last of an august line. He was the smoking wick of a candle of folly. He was the reductio ad absurdum of ludicrous syllogism based on impossible premises. He was not worth killing, he and his company of the insane. They were no more than the crown dunces of the world school. Sanity sat on the solid benches of materialism, and this heaviness waxed so dark sometimes that he almost persuaded himself that his faith was gone. The clamors of mind so loud that the whisper of the heart was unheard, the desires for earthly peace so fierce that supernatural ambitions were silenced. So dense was the gloom that, hoping against hope, believing against knowledge, and loving against truth, he cried as one had cried on another day like this, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. But that, at least, he never failed to cry. One thing alone gave him power to go on, so far at least as his consciousness was concerned, and that was his meditation. He had traveled far into the mystical life since his agonies of effort. Now he used no deliberate descents into the spiritual world. He threw, as it were, his hands over his head and dropped into spacelessness. Consciousness would draw him up, as a cork, to the surface, but he would do more than repeat his action, until by that cessation of activity, which is the supreme energy, he floated in the twilight realm of transcendence, and there God would deal with him, now by an articulate sentence, now by a sort of pain, now by an air like the vivifying breath of the sea. Sometimes, after communion, he would treat him so. Sometimes he fell asleep, sometimes in the whirl of work. Yet his consciousness did not seem to retain for long such experiences. 5 minutes later, it might be, he would be wrestling once more with the all but sensible phantoms of the mind and the heart. There he lay, then, in the chair, revolving the intolerable blasphemies that he had read. His white hair was thin upon his brown temples. His hands were as the hands of a spirit, and his young face lined and patched with sorrow. His bare feet protruded from beneath his stained tunic, and his old brown burnous lay on the floor beside him. It was an hour before he moved, and the sun had already lost half its fierceness, when the steps of the horses sounded in the paved court outside. Then he sat up, slipped his feet into their shoes, and lifted the burnous from the floor, as the door opened and the lean, sunburned priest came through. "The horses, Holiness," said the man. The Pope spoke not one word that afternoon, until the two came towards sunset up the bridle path that leads between Tabor and Nazareth. They had taken their usual round through Cana, mounting a hillock from which the long mirror of Gennesareth could be seen, and passing on, always bearing to the right, under the shadow of Tabor, until once more Esdraelon spread itself beneath like a gray-green carpet, a vast circle, 20 miles across, sprinkled parsleys with groups of huts, white walls and roofs, with none visible on the other side. Carmel heaving its long form far off to the right, and Nazareth nestling a mile or two away on the plateau on which they had halted. It was a sight of extraordinary peace, and seemed an extract from some old picture book designed centuries ago. Here was no crowd of roofs, no pressure of hot humanity, no terrible evidences of civilization and manufactory and strenuous, fruitful effort. A few tired Jews had come back to this quiet little land, and old people may return to their native place, with no hope of renewing their youth or refining their ideals, but with a kind of sentimentality that prevails so often over more logical motives. And a few more barrack-like houses had been added here and there to the obscure villages in sight. But it was very much as it had been 100 years ago. The plain was half shadowed by Carmel, and the half in dusty golden light. Overhead the clear eastern sky was flushed with rose, as it had flushed for Abraham, Jacob, and the son of David. There was no little cloud here, as a man's hand over the sea, charged with both promise and terror. No sound of chariot wheels from the earth or heaven, no vision of heavenly horses such as the young man had seen 30 centuries ago in this very sky. Here was the old earth and the old heaven, unchanged and unchangeable. The patient, returning spring had starred the thin soil with flowers of Bethlehem, and those glorious lilies to which Solomon's scarlet garments might not be compared. There was no whisper from the throne, as when Gabriel at once stooped through this very air to hail her who was blessed among women. No breath of promise or hope, beyond that which God sends through every movement of his created robe of light. As the two halted, and the horses looked out with steady, inquisitive eyes at the immensity of light and air beneath them, a soft hooting cry broke out, and a shepherd passed below along the hillside 100 yards away, trailing his long shadow behind him. And to the mellow tinkle of bells his flock came, a troop of obedient sheep and wilful goats, cropping and following and cropping again as they went on to the fold, called by name in that sad minor voice of him who knew each, and led instead of driving. The soft clanking grew fainter. The shadow of the shepherd shot once to their very feet, as he topped the rise, and vanished again as he stepped down once more, and the call grew fainter yet, and ceased. The Pope lifted his hand to his eyes for an instant, then smoothed it down his face. He nodded across to a dim patch of white walls glimmering through the violet haze of falling twilight. "That place, Father," he said, "what was its name?" The Syrian priest looked across, back once more at the Pope, and across again. "That among the palms, Holiness? Yes. That is Megiddo," he said. "Some call it Armageddon.